Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening in person, and to those of you who are online, welcome to the Asia Society. I am so honored, and it's such a pleasure to serve as the moderator for this evening's panel on our tariff. Please let me begin by introducing our esteemed panelists this evening. And I will start with our very own Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute, Wendy Cutler. Wendy joined us in 2015. She's also the Managing Director of the Asia Society's Washington, D.C. office. Before joining us in 2015, she had 30 years of she had a 30 years career in diplomacy and international trade. She was the acting trade representative at the Office of the U.S. Trade, USTR, U.S. Trade Representative. As the acting deputy representative, specifically in that capacity, she was responsible for the TPP agreement. You might remember what that was, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's a whole other panel. And she also was responsible for the bilateral negotiations with Japan. She was the chief negotiator to the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And next is our new friend to Asia Society, Amanda Rottenmund. We met last year. I attended a talk by Amanda, and she spoke so eloquently and so clearly on the vicissitudes of this art tariff issue. Amanda is an associate in the art law group at Withers Worldwide. She has focused on art law from the very beginning of her legal career, advising on many groundbreaking developments that are changing the landscape of the art market. You picked the right career. Her work includes dealing with purchases, sales, loans, consignments, and charitable giving of works of art. She was recently elected the secretary of the New York City Bar Association Art Law Committee. Welcome to Asia Society. And may I introduce and welcome our old friend to Asia Society, longtime friend to Asia Society, Jim Lally. Jim is the leading voice in Chinese art. He was a director of Chinese works of art at Sotheby's in New York and Hong Kong from 1970. In 1983, he was named president of Sotheby's in North America. And in 1986, he founded J.J. Lally & Co. He is acknowledged as the venerable voice, the voice of God from stage, and the preeminent expert on Chinese works of art and international market for Chinese art. And before we begin our conversation today, I had asked each of our panelists to give us a small lesson on their area of expertise on trade, art law, and on trade, law, and art. And we're just so privileged to benefit from your sharing with us your specialty. And so I would turn to Wendy first. Wendy, can you give us International Trade 101 in 10 minutes?
Okay, I'll try and do that, but first let me just say I'm really honored to be on a panel with such distinguished folks and people who I normally don't intersect with. And I give you a lot of credit, Agnes, for putting together this program, the idea of where policy intersects with art. I've been doing trade for a long time. I thought I knew almost everything about trade. And in studying up for this panel, I've learned there are just so many different aspects to art trade and really the effect of tariffs on Chinese art that I never really thought about. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited to hear from my fellow panelists. So that's 1 minute of my time, so I have 9 minutes left. So just a little about trade. I'm going to kind of set the scene and kind of explain why we got to this place where we did with China and what's going on in our tariff policy. International trade and trade agreements are really all about kind of opening markets. But the idea is you kind of don't want to do that by yourself. The notion is opening markets, and the more open and liberal trade is between countries, then that benefits everyone in terms of economic growth, more efficiency, better jobs, etc. But the key is you have trade negotiations because you don't want to do this by yourself. You don't want to just open up your market while everyone else's market is closed. So as a result, you enter into trade negotiations with other countries. You can do this one-on-one, which are called bilateral trade negotiations, like the negotiation we have with China that we'll get to. You can do this with a group of countries, like the TPP negotiations, which initially was with 12 countries, including the United States. Or you can do with over 100 countries, and those are, in the trade world, that really, you're talking about negotiations in the World Trade Organization in Geneva. There are basically two types of trade negotiations. One I would call kind of an FTA, a free trade negotiation. And then in that negotiation, both partners or a group of countries sit down. They all have the same shared objective of wanting to open up their market. They all kind of want to be there. And the notion is you have a shared objective where you want to go to. It doesn't mean that the negotiation's easy necessarily, but it's easier than the other type of negotiation, which I'll get to now, which kind of characterizes the U.S. China negotiation. In the second type of negotiation, really one country is the demander. They feel that the other country has not opened up their market and is, pursuing unfair trade practices. So therefore, the one country asks the other country, come to the table. We want you to change, the way you're doing business, open your markets, get rid of your barriers. And that, I think, kind of characterizes in a very simple way the U.S. China negotiations. China basically, in short, did not want to be at this negotiating table with the United States and was very reluctant to open their market further to the United States. And so the United States, in turn, had to look for leverage. How are they going to get China's attention to come to the table and to make meaningful commitments that would result in structural change to open up their market for the long term? And the Trump administration, when it was thinking what's the best leverage to use, it decided that tariffs and increasing tariffs, which in essence are taxes on imports, was the way to go. This would not only bring China to the table, but it would also kind of force them to make concessions if they wanted to get the tariffs lifted. Well, it kind of didn't turn out that way. And what happened was the United States imposed tranches or buckets of tariffs. The first bucket was at tariffs aimed at $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. China came to the table eventually, but China responded by putting its own tariffs on the table. And then they didn't make the concessions the U.S. wanted. So then the U.S. put more tariffs on Chinese imports, and then China responded. And so we ended up in what was called a trade war, or an escalation of tariffs between the two countries. And that's kind of where I think tonight's discussion is going. As someone who's worked on, for years, kind of trade negotiations, but also at times trying to put together lists of products that would hit another country and hurt them, it's very difficult to come up with a list of products where the other side gets hurt, but U.S. interests are not affected. And every year this becomes more and more difficult because the world is much more interconnected. So when you're trying to pick products to hurt the other country, you want to maximize the hurt against the other country, in this case China, while minimizing the harm on U.S. interest. That could be U.S. consumers, U.S. workers, U.S. companies, here U.S. art collectors and art dealers. And so as the U.S. government got into this trade war with China, as it added more and more imports to this list of products on which to put tariffs, it ended up hurting U.S. interests more and more, while also hurting China, but maybe in some cases hurting U.S. interests more than China was hurt. Eventually, we did reach a trade agreement with China. It's hard to believe. It was announced about 2 months ago. It came into effect a few weeks ago. And as a result of this agreement, both sides agreed not to put a pause on further tariff hikes, but they also agreed to have to put in half the rate of tariffs on about $120 billion worth of Chinese imports, which were imposed in September. And that, my understanding, that's where the the art products came under the September retaliation list. There are basically two ways to get rid of these tariffs. One is through what's called an exclusion process, where U.S. parties are invited to come into my former office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and explain why they need an exclusion, why these tariffs are hurting the United States, and in some cases not hurting China. So you can try the exclusion process. Many parties submitted exclusions. I think USTR has received over 50,000 petitions for exclusions. And so you can imagine the workload in trying to go through these. The other way to get rid of the tariffs is if the United States and China both agreed to roll back their tariffs and really kind of get rid of them. As I mentioned, in the trade agreement that was reached in September, the U.S. did agree to roll back some tariffs that they imposed in September, but even with the Phase 1 trade deal in effect, the United States still has tariffs on $370 billion worth of Chinese imports, which comprises about 2/3 of all Chinese imports. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that's kind of laid the groundwork for the discussion, and hopefully you could all follow me.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Before we get to Amanda, because I think this is relevant to Amanda's introduction, so I checked the latest list, which is about 205 pages. So I picked out a couple items on there that are under that we incur a tariff: blasting machines, eels, live eels, I presume, exotic goldfish, hats, and then paintings and drawings executed entirely by hand, original sculptures, and antiques more than 100 years old. So Amanda, can you give us a parameter of, and help us understand, how did art get in there?
Yes.
With exotic goldfish.
And hats. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Agnes. I'm so honored to be on this stage with everyone, talking about something that is ever moving and ever exciting. So how did art end up being subject to tariffs, and really what are tariffs, especially if you're in the art industry? In the US, generally, we don't have customs duties or tariffs on artworks. So usually, we don't get really bothered about customs duties, because when you go to Chapter 97 of the U.S. Harmonized Tariff Schedule and you look up paintings, you'll see next to it in the chart, free. So if you were just bringing in a painting that's a normal piece that's coming, let's say Jasper John's coming into the U.S. and it was in London, it's coming into the U.S., there's not going to be a customs duty or a tariff on it, which is very different from how a lot of other countries operate. And so when we heard that there was going to be, around in 2018 in the summer, there was all this talk about the trade war, and that potentially artworks that were Chinese origin artworks were going to be subject to, at that time, what was being floated as a 25% tariff, the art market got really concerned, because tariffs, as I said, are not something we factor into this market. It's not something that they're thinking of when they're thinking about the costs for bringing things in for the U.S. art market. And really, what does it look like? Let's say you're moving a painting into the U.S. What happens? Well, when it goes through customs, that's when you would be assessed this tariff, this customs duty, and that's how it gets figured in with the cost of bringing something in. And what is the effect of this? Well, usually we're happy that there's no customs duty on artwork, because it promotes the ease of cultural movement. We're not always just talking about trade. We're talking about artworks that come in for exhibition and loan. And so having a 0% rate is really beneficial, because you can have cultural property moving between museums at a lower cost. If something's subject to a tariff, you have a higher cost. So that's a little bit of background generally so you understand the practicalities of how tariffs were affecting the art market. So what happened? What's the timeline? So as I mentioned, in 2018, in the summer, we heard there were potentially, the Trump administration was going to put artwork on as subject to the Chinese tariffs, and then it went away. And we breathed a sigh of relief. Then fast forward to last August, and the U.S. Trade Representative announced that artworks would be subject to a 10% tariff effective September 1st, 2019. 10 days later, August 30th, the U.S. Trade Representative announced artworks would be subject to a 15% tariff effective September 1st. So September 1st, 2019, 15% on paintings and engravings and lithographs coming in that were Chinese origin. In January 22nd, the U.S. Trade Representative announced that artworks would be subject to 7.5% effective February 14th, 2020. So they've now gone down to 7.5%, and that was effective last month, February 14th, what I'm calling the Valentine's Day gift. So what we saw were some people were waiting to see what was going to shake up. The import duty went down, so there's a little bit of cost savings there in terms of things that are coming in. So now let's talk about what is the duty on. So it's on these items, and what is Chinese paintings? So what matters is it's any product whose last substantial transformation occurred in China. And substantial transformation is the country where the product became an article of commerce with a new and distinct name. And transshipping, use, or display in other countries and time outside of China do not affect the Chinese origin of the product.
Can you just repeat the last two sentences again?
Transshipping, use, display in other countries, and time outside of China do not affect the Chinese origin of the product. So let me give you an example. A Chinese vase that was made, let's say, 200 years ago in China is currently in Sweden. It's owned by a Swedish collector. It's sitting there. It's supposed to come into New York for auction at, let's say, Christie's in May. That vase, although it has not been in China in 100 years, would be subject to this tariff because it's Chinese origin. The vase was produced in China. Now let's do another example. A Chinese artist has a studio in China and also a studio in Paris. The Chinese artist produces a painting in the Paris studio. The painting is then shipped into the US. That painting is not a Chinese origin painting and is not subject to the tariff. However, if that painting had been produced in the China studio, it would be subject to the tariff. So they're really looking at things that are made in China, that the last substantial transformation happened in China. And so I think that's important because it seems rather punitive because so many things, especially antiquities and antiques, have long been outside of China, but yet they're still subject to this tariff. And I think that's interesting for everyone. So Wendy briefly mentioned the exclusion process, and that's something that was available for these pieces. It opened on October 31st, 2019. Essentially, it was an online portal where you could file an application. You would provide different data points about your business and about the imports that you bring into the U.S., and you would essentially plead to the government as to why it was unfair for you to be subject to the tariffs. And they're reviewing each of these applications on a case-by-case basis. The period for the review of the applications closed on January 31st, 2020 at about 11:59 p.m. And I can tell you that day I was still finishing an application. So it was very much something that people were using. And I think what's interesting about the applications when you look at them is especially in the art context, because yes, many of the applications are for widgets and valves and all the things that you can imagine major American industrial manufacturing companies import into the US that are made in China. But in the art context, because of the cultural point that is embedded in the sharing of cultural objects, the argumentation was very interesting as to how people were asking for relief from the government. And so I'm just going to read you a couple quotes from the Sotheby's application for relief, because I think it's interesting. The Section 301 tariff on Chinese origin paintings, drawings, and pastels has no impact on and no relevance to Made in China 2025 or other Chinese industrial programs. As a general matter, the art market is completely distinct from the market for industrial and manufactured goods. Because each painting, drawing, or pastel is not fungible and is unique in nature, no replacements for Chinese origin paintings exists. And it will result in increased demand for and it will not result in increased demand for American-made paintings, drawings, and pastels. So what they're trying to say is, if we can't bring in these Chinese origin artworks, there's no substitute. It's not that you can make this artwork in the US, like you could make a valve in the US that's produced in China and maybe it would just be more expensive. Artwork is unique and it's so important and different, and we can't just bring it in. And what it ultimately happens is the market is going to shift outside of the US because it'll become less expensive in other jurisdictions for Chinese origin artwork to be sold. So just as my example that I presented to you, if a Chinese artist who produces their artwork in China is represented by galleries in the US, those galleries now have to take a hit essentially every time they're bringing inventory into the US to sell to the US market. So that 7.5% tariff is now being passed to the consumer. And so to buy that artist's artwork in the United States, it's now more expensive than if you were buying that artist's artwork in Paris or London or in China directly. And so that's the type of arguments that you see Sotheby's and Christie's and all the dealers making in their applications to try and persuade the government to see that this is not fair on the art market.
It's so interesting you brought up the point of American protectionism. So I found an academic article that I had shared with Wendy. It's 50 pages long. And this article tracks the history of art tariff in America. And I discovered that there was, in 1882, there was an argument on American protectionism, American protectionist view on imposing an art tariff. At the time, the Senate was proposing to increase the tariff to 40%. And their argument was, America's artists, and I quote, America's artists, if given a 40% tariff protection, could then produce work comparable to European art. Otherwise, Americans faced competitive disadvantages since they lacked government patronage, such as federal scholarships or national institutions of art. And before we turn to Jim, I know you will probably agree with this quote that I found. Joseph Choate, who was a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum in 1913, said, "This art tariff is fundamentally anti-educational, anti-American, and a relapse into barbarism." Jim.
Strong words, but I agree with them all. I've been asked, my brief is to look directly at the art market as it's evolved, particularly the market for Chinese art over the years. And I think the first thing we all need to know is that collecting Chinese art has a long and venerable tradition in China, perhaps a longer and more sophisticated tradition than any other country in the world. If we look back 1,000 years to the emperor of the Sung dynasty, Hui Sung, who was himself a great calligrapher and painter and man of great culture, he is the archetypal Chinese collector of Chinese art. Collecting out of respect for the ancients, he formed a great collection of archaic bronzes, as well as rubbings of ancient inscriptions. And all through the following dynasties, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing, everyone who was collecting Chinese art in China followed that great paradigm of trying to gather the finest examples from the ancients and study them also with the philosophy of the ancients. Fast forward to the 19th century, when you have more interaction between the West and China, and the art market is becoming more international. The great argument in favor of international travel is just what Mr. Choate or Senator Choate and you were bringing out, is that we learn by understanding. We learn to understand each other and to work with each other through culture, much more than through other disputations, which are the daily thrust and cut of work internationally. Travelers in China may have gone there to do business, as the Swedish engineers went to build the railroads in China, but over and over again, whether they were tourists or businessmen, they were struck by the beauty and the mystery and the wonder of Chinese art, which was very exotic to our eyes as Westerners. And as the museums in America began to develop, it became clear that a claim to be a universal world museum demands that you include the great civilizations of the world. You cannot exclude China. It's one of the greatest civilizations in history and continues to be essential to any universal museum, whether it's the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum. And that tariff, which was on artworks in various times during the United States history, was repealed in 1909 when the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act exempted all art from any country, and all antiques over 100 years old. And that's what we've been, as you were saying, living under for years, happily saying to the customs man, sorry, it's art, no tax, thanks very much, see you next time. But the supporters of that policy, I think, had no hearing in the current round of tariffs. I think there was just a general misunderstanding that somehow China was going to be made to behave more leniently towards Western intervention in their business practices by telling them we were not going to allow Chinese art into the United States. That would only harm the United States. And in fact, the Chinese are very happy to have Chinese art in China. It doesn't hurt them in the least. The Chinese policy as it regards the art market has been ups and downs. Since World War II, there's been a slow recovery in Japan and a lot of activity in the art market that was no longer really making sense, was driven by the auctions and the collections and collectors who became quite specific in what they were collecting. In 1950, when the armistice of World War II was over, when the armistice of World War II was declared followed by the Korean War, began in 1950. In 1950, there was an outbreak of war which brought China into the Korean War. When China joined the Korean War, at that point in time, the United States government slapped an embargo on all Chinese goods, including art. And that embargo continued until Nixon went to China in 1972. So people are often asking me, when is this tariff going to go away? We have no idea when it's going to go away, because the people making the decision are, I think, not understanding the place of art in commerce. But the Japanese led the market in the 1960s and 1970s because America was held back. America missed a golden opportunity to build collections of Chinese art for the major museums because there was this embargo enforced by the Treasury Department that if you tried to import a work of art from China, you were accused of dealing with a communist nation. You had to have affidavits signed saying the person who made it was not a communist and was never a communist. And this held back the trade in America drastically and turned American citizens who might have become collectors to choose another field because there was this bad feeling about Chinese art. Meanwhile, in China, they had their own problems with the Cultural Revolution and the assault on the four olds, one of which was simply old things. And vast amounts of Chinese art was destroyed by Red Guards and by a really benighted policy. But at all that going on, it finally turned around in the 1980s when Deng Xiaoping became the practical leader of China. And Deng had many pithy phrases, one of which is, poverty is not socialism, and to be rich is glorious. Mm-hmm. And China was he led China towards working with the international community in business, and opening up China was a way to modernize China. So the Chinese citizens who had been out of the art market since the 1949 declaration when the communists took over China, they outlawed collecting and trading in Chinese art, and they confiscated the inventories of the great Chinese art dealers such as C.T. Liu, and they confiscated artworks from wealthy citizens of China. And no one in China was allowed or able to collect Chinese art for approximately 30 years. But in 1989, the modernization of China was well underway, and then the Japanese led the market. No one could compete with the Japanese, but the Chinese were out of the market. With Deng Xiaoping's new policy came to fruition in 1990s. In 1993, there was the founding of major auction houses such as China Guardian in China, and there was a liberalization of policy, and so Chinese citizens were once again able to collect Chinese art. And the story from that point forward to where we are here in 2020, the 30 years of the period from 1990 to 2020 has been a steady advance of Chinese collectors to reach once again the pinnacle of the collecting world in China and around the world. As we sit here discussing what's happening, the example that comes to mind just this weekend on Saturday in a little town called Bourges in France, in the middle of France, there was an auction, and it was an auction of the estate of a person nobody's ever heard of, and it had furniture and paintings and drawings and so forth, and it had a porcelain vase that was in the auction. It turns out it was a blue and white vase of the 18th century, an imperial Qinlong moon flask with a dragon on it. It started out at about 10,000 euros and ended up at 4.9 million euros. And the buyer was a Chinese bidder on the telephone. And that's the world we live in now, where the Chinese have had a tremendous resurgence in the art market. The Chinese mainland buyers, especially, of course, the diaspora in Hong Kong and Taiwan had access before, but now that the mainland is very, very much involved, they are the driver, the leaders in the art market. And applying a U.S. tariff on Chinese art has absolutely no impact on that, except to encourage people not to bring Chinese art to America, not to use Chinese art, not to sell their Chinese art in America. And it's hard how many applications you've seen that asking for relief from this tariff. It's hard to understand why it is still the thinking of the government of the United States that somehow by stopping the import of Chinese art, they're going to be twisting the arm of the Chinese government. It's quite the opposite.
If I may supplement what Jim just said, the statistics that I have is that in 2018, the total art market of Chinese art was, the total art market is 7.1 billion. 5.1 billion happened within China, and 408 million in the United States.
Yes.
So it's significantly less.
Overwhelming, yes.
So my first question, first of all, thank you to all three of you. I know giving the 101 introductory lesson is probably the hardest. Wendy, let me start by asking you, amongst blasting machines, eels, exotic goldfish, in your 30 years as a trade negotiator, have you seen anything like this art tariff? And what was the administration thinking?
So a couple of things here. No, I mean, up until the Trump administration, while other administrations I worked for, both Republican and Democrat, would impose tariffs against other countries, the overall value of the tariffs, the amount of imports they hit, was very small in comparison to the types of tariff application we've seen under the Trump administration. This is President Trump's kind of trade weapon of choice. They're numbers. He understands them. He thinks it's unfair if China has a 15% tariff on autos. We have a 2.5% tariff. Unfair. We need to correct that. So it's, you know, it's a policy that he believes is one that is needed vis-a-vis China, even though it breaks the rules of the World Trade Organization. And that is because, in his view, the rules of the WTO don't address Chinese unfair trade practices. So the United States needs to take things into their own hands. And again, I don't think the intention when this all started was to end up with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of tariffs. I think the hope, at least of many in the administration, that by imposing that first set of tariffs on $34 billion worth of imports would be sufficient to get China to come to the table and to say, okay, what do we need to do? And as a result, the tariffs would be lifted. It didn't play out like that. So again, we're in an uncharted world of tariffs. And the fact that we're even sitting here in the Asia Society, in the art world, talking about the impact of tariffs, I think that just underscores how much damage these tariffs do to the United States. Now, to be a devil's advocate here, let me just put something forward, and that is that, you have people, professionals in the government now looking at these tens of thousands of exclusion requests put forward by different U.S. parties. And in each of these requests for exclusions, meaning don't apply the tariff to us, because most of the parties who put forward their reasons, they're pretty compelling. So, for example, if you're an auto company and the so-called widget that's made in China is the only one that's produced in the world that lets you make the car, and if you can't make the car, you may have to lay off thousands of people, that's a compelling case for an exclusion in my mind. If you're a farmer and you're going to go bankrupt because you can't sell your soybeans to China with these tariffs, and you're putting forward a request for an exclusion, that's compelling as well. And so I'm not saying, and believe me, I'm not saying at all, because I've learned a lot about the art world. I think the points made here are valid as well. But again, if the policy is to really hit China with all of these tariffs, and I don't think that's a great policy, but that's the policy the president is following, then his view is almost everyone then needs to be heard a bit, because over the long term, this is going to benefit America if we have a level playing field with China and we can get rid of their unfair trade practices.
So he's essentially taxing culture.
Exactly, but not just culture. I mean, again, $370 billion worth of imports are subject to tariffs, and many of them are greater than 7.5%. For many products, they're facing a 25% tariff. That's, extremely high. And he would probably say with the group that's facing a 7.5% tariff, that's relatively low. And, as you mentioned earlier, initially we were looking at 15% tariffs. Again, I'm not justifying this. I'm just adding some, information to our discussion.
Thank you, Wendy. I want to go back to a point, and this is followed by a question to both of you, Amanda and Jim. Amanda, you mentioned the difference between the definition of origin in China, from China. Anything that Jim would deal with has to have an origin from China. These are Chinese antiquities. They were in China, regardless if they had left China 200, 300 years ago. The origin is China. But you also gave the example of a Chinese artist who has a studio in Berlin. Actually, Ai Weiwei has been used as an example. His works of art are not being subjected to this tariff because he completed the work in his Berlin studio. So Amanda, if I were an American artist, but somehow my origin of creation is in China, would my work be subject to this tariff?
So we had posed this query at the talk that you were at when I attended, and we had, it's interesting, like if you're a sculptor and you're based in the US, but you had a foundry in China, and so you had your sculpture produced there, but then let's say it came back to the US and then you blessed it in the US. When is it China origin? I don't know the exact answer on that. I think if it was, it could be taxed, it could be considered Chinese origin. I think their customs would have an argument and you would probably have to defend against it. But I think if you're producing anything in China and it was coming in and the export location is China, I think you would be faced with the potential of having to be paying the tariff.
So that is so interesting. That was one point we talked about when I first met you, was that it didn't occur to me that the nationality of the artist did not matter.
No.
Was never part of this conversation.
And I would add here that basically a rule of origin is an extremely technical issue, but is very important. As you can see here, you have to define what is Chinese art, what is the origin. And it seems to me that the general rule of substantial transformation, where was the location this product was, underwent substantial transformation. This is the rule that's used for most products. And so it's almost like taking a rule that applies to widgets or a rule that applies to autos and now just, saying now it applies to art. And this is why I find this conversation so fascinating, because I had never thought about what does this rule mean vis-a-vis art? Because you're right, you're looking at the location where that item was substantially transformed, which in the art world, I guess, means where you painted the picture, where you sculpted the sculpture, where you drew the picture.
Right.
I'm unclear still. Did the painter in China who's an American? Well, it's still a matter of dispute, isn't it, whether he can come through tariff-free?
Right. I said I don't know the answer. It's a hypothetical.
Now, that's the reason why people hate to get off the airplane and go through customs, because there are so many things that you may feel you have a perfectly flat case, but if you get in a fight with a customs officer, you always lose-lose.
Right.
So it has the effect of putting a dampening effect on the whole process. No one wants to go to that country, no one wants to collect art from that country. Find me a place where it's fun. And that's what the art market is grappling with here. There's a tariff that harms, in many ways, the U.S., but has zero impact in China. As a matter of fact, if you're a dealer in China or an auctioneer in China, you're very happy to have that U.S. tariff put on. And my feeling is it was put in place simply by Mr. Trump getting up one morning and saying, everything that begins with C, put a tariff on it. It's collateral damage is the art material. It's no intention. And over again, when you begin to talk to people who are involved, they really do not understand the difference between how different works of art and unique objects are from a manufactured product and something which is repeatable and fungible. And I think there should be more understanding of that in the USTR's office and in the White House, but there doesn't seem to be.
But, so I'm having studied a little bit of the history of our tariff in America. If the argument, this is the part I don't quite get, if the argument is that our tariff is to protect American artists, the interest of American art market, why would the tariff tax American artists abroad creating works that are being imported back to the United States? So I checked that particular circumstance against all the previous tariffs, our tariffs. Not one would have, all of them would have exempted all American artists abroad creating work, because the whole point is that we're protecting American interest. So I think that's something that it's
I think it's just a disconnect, as Wendy was saying, with respect to the way the regulations are drafted, because I think it would apply in so few cases. It's a hypothetical that we've discussed. I don't know if there's any actual artists who are now producing with foundries or anything in China that this would apply to. So I think that they didn't think it through. A lot of the times, art doesn't fit well into certain regulations, whether they be tariff regulations or tax regulations, just because art is such a unique type of property. So it's not handled in the same way as widgets being mass produced for import. So I think, they're also probably not thinking about the distinction that I made with a vase that's been sitting in Sweden and was produced in China 200 years ago. That's not really getting at, that's not harming directly any Chinese businesses. So I think it's just not thought about. I think it's not, they didn't go through the fact patterns and run the analysis. It's just, these are items, let's put a duty on them, let's make it more expensive.
And it's really a punitive duty. Mm-hmm. It's not trying to protect America as much as trying to twist the arm of whoever makes the decision in China to be more cooperative with regards to things that American businesses need.
Yeah. So it's actually fundamentally different from the previous art tariffs.
I think
so. Yeah.
So Jim, let me go back to that vase that has left China 200 years ago and has been in Switzerland. How has this new tariff affected the antiquities trade and the contemporary art trade differently?
Well, I think the contemporary art trade is beyond my brief. I've only handled antiquities, but I think the effect is pretty much the same, that bringing things in from China becomes a hassle. It becomes a nuisance, and it becomes an expense. And it has the effect of raising the cost of all that large category. They're both equally subject to an increased cost. And it puts a spin on your activity. If you're choosing to collect, you're choosing to do that for the pleasure of it, for the joy of learning and the pleasure of having beautiful objects, or other people do it just for investment. Whatever their motivation, they're going to look for the path of least resistance. And it becomes clear when you go to China, you are subjected to a complete bar against your buying anything serious in mainland China and bringing it out. I've never in my career ever bought anything in mainland China and brought it out. Before World War II, in the 20s and 30s, everybody was going to China buying things, bringing it out. Now we have people coming from China to buy things and take it back home. But the motivation, it was meant to be pleasure, not to be something where you're constantly wondering if they're going to put a ban on what it is you're collecting, or put an extra barrier, or make you feel like you're doing the wrong thing. And I think that's the worst effect, that culture should be something that brings a good conversation between nations. And to include it in with the widgets is a great mistake for both sides.
I hate to bring up the topic of COVID-19, but I know it's on everyone's mind. So I want to go back to Jim. You were recently quoted by New York Times. You said, "For my exhibition next month, I would say more than half of it was acquired outside the United States. So to bring that in and add 15%, I think this is before it was decreased down to 7.5. That's what we used to call the profit margin." And then you said, and this is an article actually on how the coronavirus has affected the art market. And we will talk about Asia Week and other auction activities momentarily. You concluded by saying, "It's two unfortunate things on top of each other that affect opposite ends of the market. It's not a good time."
Not a good moment, no. And it is spinning out more and more. I mean, today I had 2 different museum groups call and say they've made the decision not to come to New York for Asia Week. And as we all know, a lot of things have been canceled. It's one of the 2 things is an act of God, and the other is an act of stupidity. So one we could control and one we can't. We should focus on the ones we can. But during the period when you're putting the show together, You're going around trying to find the most beautiful, most important things you can find for your exhibition. And you don't really mind, or in the good old days, you didn't mind if you found it in London or you found it in Paris or you found it in New York. Now, a New York participant in the Chinese art market is subject to a penalty if you find a good thing outside and you have that extra cost, so that you're put at a competitive disadvantage to everyone else. If you're bidding in a London auction, everybody who's not American has an advantage over your cost basis. So it's really a deterrent to advancement of the business that should be an American business that has every right to thrive without any good impact anywhere else. I mean, that's the only thing that COVID-19 and this tariff on art share, is it's just bad for everybody.
Amanda, could you give us an update on what's happening in the auction world?
I mean, I think it's a moving target. I think we were checking today what was going to happen with the May sales and what's happening with the sales that were scheduled in Asia, whether they're going to all move to New York. Again, I think that this week a lot will probably come out and probably early next week. But I think we are now anticipating that things are going to be very different this spring. And potentially you already see that consignment agreements are now being planned out through spring 2021. So people who were potentially selling in May or June are now looking, well, what happens if we're going into November, and then if November doesn't happen, what's happening next year? So everyone on the ground is kind of shuffling around because there is a real effect. And I think there are calls tomorrow about whether Art Basel Switzerland is actually going to happen or if they're going to cancel. So there are real effects. I think people are shutting down. So it could be a blessing in disguise. What if the tariffs went away and then nothing was sold because of COVID, and then we all reemerge next year to a tariff-free landscape? That might be interesting. But I don't know if that will happen, but we could hope.
Wendy, can you be the fortune teller? What's going to happen?
Again, I think there's two ways for these tariffs to be lifted. Again, one is through the exclusion process, and it seems like your industry is aggressively pursuing those exclusions, and you have very good, valid reasons for seeking the exclusion. The other is, again, a decision by the administration to just lift some tariffs, roll back some tariffs. And that could happen. And one of the ways that could happen, number one, is if this phase one agreement is implemented on time in line with the commitments that were made by China. And to date, China has been implementing its commitments, particularly with respect to agriculture, to intellectual property, and to financial services. The area where China is least likely to be able to fully live up to the commitments in the agreement fall with respect to the purchasing commitments it made. Now, these purchasing commitments call for this year for China to purchase about $78 billion more of U.S. goods and services than were purchased in 2017. This was going to be a stretch in any case, but now with the coronavirus and China basically shutting down for a couple of months, and and even now businesses not fully up to capacity in China, a lot of people still at home, people not being able to get to their workplace, and let's be honest, people not consuming as much. And then, if you look what might happen in the U.S., it's all an unknown, but you could see a situation where some of us are told to stay at home, and as a result, we're not producing what we need to sell to China. So those purchasing commitments may not be fully implemented, but I think under the circumstances, that should be recognized and understood by both sides, that even though China really tried in this environment, it's just not possible. So back to my the point I'm trying to make is that I do see a scenario where there will be some tariff rollback. And if I had to predict, I think the rollback would happen first with respect to that $120 billion worth of imports that are now subject to the 7.5% where the artwork falls under. And I say this, and it's because those are the last tariffs that were implemented. Mm-hmm. The fact that they were already cut in half, to me, suggests that the administration understands that the products hit in that tranche of tariffs are really hurting U.S. interests more than they're hurting China. And in the case of art, as you say, they're probably not even hurting China at all.
So, Amanda, I have a technical question before we turn to the audience. And I just want to invite those of you with questions to please come down here. There's a microphone. And ask your question while we give people time to make it down the stairs. A technical question for you. Since the number has changed so many times, it was 25% at one point, 15%, now 7.5%. Technically, if people had already paid the previous 15% and now it's lowered to 7.5%, do they
whether
get
it's retroactive, whether you get it, I believe it is, and I believe you can apply for a refund. But I have to check the regs and see if you can, but you might be able to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
We can't see you.
I can't. We can't see from the stage. Those of you who have a question, since we do not have a microphone going around, please come down here. We do have two questions from our online, except here we go. So the first question that came through is, oh, excuse me, Yoshi, I think we have a slight technical complication. Excuse me. It's not pulling up to the questions.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Could it be that the tariffs were intended to be a tax on the repatriation of Chinese art by Chinese collectors? In other words, making it more expensive. Or do I have it backwards?
Backwards.
Yeah, I think it's backwards.
It's backwards.
Yeah.
Because it's when you bring things into the U.S. If it goes into China, China has its own customs duties. So this would be if you were buying something in the U.S. and importing it into the U.S., you get hit with the 7.5%.
Does it have anything to do with repatriation, conceivably?
Nothing
No.
at all. Nothing whatsoever. If anything, it encourages Chinese art to stay in China.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, you do raise the point, just to clarify, the tariffs, China's not paying those tariffs.
Yeah.
If we impose tariffs against China, it's the U.S. importer who pays those tariffs. Now, at some point, if a product, as a result of the tariffs, gets more expensive, then yeah, the demand may go down and China might be affected. But, it's not like China is paying these, $370 billion worth of tariffs or what, yeah.
And recall, what makes it so unusual with art is that it's not necessarily coming from China because it's Chinese origin artwork. So it could be an artwork that is Chinese origin, but it's coming from, I'm going to use, it's coming from France, or it's coming from Switzerland, or it's coming from Ecuador or Mexico. But because it was produced in China 200 years ago, it's subject to the tariff. But effectively, it hasn't been in China in so long. It has no connection. So that's what makes the artwork so interesting.
Can I interject before the next question? I forgot to ask this question. Is this tariff reciprocal on the Chinese side? Has China added a art tariff on the trading table?
So I pulled,
negotiating table?
in anticipation of this question, I pulled a book that goes through kind of all the different laws of importing for different countries, and it's a little bit old, but China already had customs duties on artworks that were already in place in addition to VAT. So I think that I don't know if they've increased their tariffs, but they already have tariffs on artwork, unlike how we were zero rate and exempted artwork.
I see.
So they had a different system altogether.
But China does have, many tariffs in place against U.S. imports. I think it's about at $110 billion worth of the $150 billion worth of exports of goods that we sell to China. And so it'd be a question of looking at that HS number and seeing if that was, if that was covered in China's tariff hikes.
Yeah.
But again, you're right. If China already had a tariff, that would just mean they made it higher.
Right.
It's different when it's zero.
Right.
And you're in a zero world. It's a very different world when the tariffs are increased.
And it's not specifically art originated from America.
Right. I think China just has a different tariffs.
Yeah, it's like a
on
luxury
artwork.
tax. It's whatever,
Exactly.
wherever it comes from. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Well, that was my first question. So the tariff that you've been talking about that the U.S. imposes is actually in retaliation potentially for a tariff or a tax that China's been imposing for some time. I think that's the point that was just made. With respect to other countries, I understand, for example, that France imposes, and perhaps other European countries impose VAT on the import of art. And so really is the U.S. that far out of line with what the rest of the world is doing with respect to the art market?
So VAT and customs duties are different. And so in the US, we have a similar system. So federally, customs duties, when you bring something in, you are importing it, the customs duty is owed. But sales and use tax is a state concept that still exists. And those are taxes. So if you buy, let's use my example of the 200-year-old vase, you bring it into the US, you now have to pay this 7.5% tariff on it. But when you bring it into New York City and you're using it because you live in New York City and you're putting it in your New York City apartment, you are technically supposed to pay an 8.875% use tax to New York State on your annual income tax return. So we already always have these state and use taxes here. So the fact that in France and Europe they've got VAT, you would also be paying that anyway. And they also have different customs duties. What's different here is because there are suspension systems. So let's say there was an exhibition in France of a lot of different Chinese items that were going to be presented in the Louvre or something. You would be able to apply for a suspension from VAT when it was temporarily there. The customs duties that are being levied as part of this China trade war, you can't get an exception for them. So if you were to bring something into the US to be on exhibit at the Met, you would still have to pay the custom duty. You wouldn't get an exemption from it.
But can I ask you a question then?
Yeah.
So you're saying that even if the artwork is loaned to a museum
There's no exemption process right now. There was talk about whether you could get a temporary bond, and then if it exits the country, then you could get the tariff back, a rebate back. But the money would still have to be paid up front.
Right.
So it's still a cost. So if you were a curator putting on a show, you'd still have to be thinking and running the numbers with respect to how expensive the import would be.
And this also is a deterrent to people bringing things to art fairs in America, whether it's contemporary art or ancient art. It just, again, makes you say, well, I guess I better pick another field because there's going to be so much trouble and so much risk and cost. And, of course, the auction houses have more options to go to other locations, and a lot of things that might have been sold in New York, but if they're hit by a tariff, to come into New York just to be sold, well, send them to Switzerland. We don't mind. It's an international market. And Chinese art is very much an international market. As you can sell a $1 million vase in France just as easily as you can in America. And this is something that the tariff, again, is not only not productive of the result that is sought by the Trump administration, but it's counterproductive in many ways.
I have several questions from our online viewers. Maria asks, do auction houses such as Christie's or Sotheby's have political clout to lobby for less tariffs on Chinese antiques? I think she's specific. I'm not sure if she means Chinese art or specifically Chinese antiques, but she said Chinese antiques.
I mean, I think what we've seen in these exclusion processes is that dealers and auction houses are all kind of in the same boat and have all been petitioning. And it'll be interesting to see with the government how they respond to these exclusions. There was a notice and comment period associated with the exclusion. So basically your application went public and then other people can publish comments. And when I pulled some of the applications for tonight, I think it's interesting to look at some of the comments because you see other dealers supporting the other dealers' applications and saying, these tariffs are so unjust and it's so unfair. And I think there was a lot of press about it. Mm-hmm. But at the end, I think what Wendy said is absolutely accurate. I think the government is taking a really bright line here, and they really want to bring China to the table, and so they knew that this would hurt. So it's not really about leverage at this point with respect to the art market. I think we're not necessarily sympathetic in the eyes of the administration.
Right, particularly, again, when so many industries and workers and farmers are hurting as well.
Mm-hmm. The art market isn't going to be sympathetic if there are, farmers who can't sell soybeans in Idaho. So,
yeah.
I
wouldn't want to be the one now sitting in my old agency looking through all these exclusions. Because they probably each one, are making, there are probably a lot of good arguments that are being put forward.
Yeah.
But, the overall policy is we want to keep as many tariffs in place as possible. So you're looking for the most, compelling argument where the U.S. is going to be hurt the most. And the question is, what is the standard that's used? Is it the number of workers? Is it bankruptcies? Is it loss of exchange of culture,
Yeah.
So.
I think that's the real spirit that the art market has a chance of just, this hurts the exchange of culture and education. And we can keep saying that. And we'll see if the administration and the trade office listens.
Well, as Mr. Choate said, it's a relapse to barbarism. The second question is from Margaret. And she calls herself Margaret the Optimist. Okay. Her question is, do the panelists see any way in which COVID-19 could beneficially affect the global economy, and specifically in Chinese antiques trade? I believe she probably means overall Chinese art trade, not just specifically in antiquity, since the tariffs and COVID-19 affect all art, regardless of age.
I think if we see that everything gets canceled and then all of a sudden the tariffs go away and then we've got this, a good timing outcome. If people are holding and not selling and not importing, and then next year COVID is gone and maybe the tariffs get rolled back, that would be an ideal situation.
I know that certain parties are urging the administration, just lift all the tariffs if you want to give, a good sign to the economy and get things, going forward. And getting our economy back on track, then just lift all the tariffs. I think the administration has already responded that that's not happening.
But an interesting point with the market activity this week and how down it was yesterday, there could be increased pressure if the market continues to fluctuate so much on the administration to lift the tariffs, if that would eject a positive, effect into the market, because the administration is also facing an election in November, so they're not going to want the market to go down too much. So there are a lot of things that could happen. It's actually very interesting.
Right.
Well, she is Margaret the Optimist.
Yes. So we're trying to find that silver lining, Margaret.
We're looking for you.
Well, next question, Simon, who is asking you all to be fortune tellers. How will the Chinese art trade world look in the event of a democratic administration?
The art trade under a democratic administration would be hopefully improved by getting out of the tariffs, because they would have comprehension that it was a negative and not a positive. Otherwise, it's like the stock market. The president takes responsibility whenever it goes up, but doesn't want to take responsibility when it goes down. In the art market, most presidents have a laissez-faire attitude, and knowing that they should have nothing to do with it. So I don't think that it'd be a dramatic impact either way.
Agree.
My view is, even though some of the Democratic candidates have questioned the use of tariffs, more broadly, when it comes to China, they've been a bit more quiet, and I think there is strong bipartisan support for getting tough on China. I think if they came into office, if a Democratic candidate came into office and all these tariffs were in place, I don't see them just coming in and lifting those tariffs on day one or day three of their administration. I think they're going to have to show that they got something for it from China.
Yeah, I agree. I think this exclusion process will be interesting. I think the Democratic administration might be a little bit more affected by the educational and cultural arguments, maybe, but I do think that they are a little bit quiet about the tariffs, and so we would have to see.
Next question is from Maxwell. He asks, as someone who owns Chinese antique and who is preparing his will, is there any general advice that the speakers could share? I presume I'm guessing Max is in the United States, but I do not know.
Yeah, I think that if you're a collector and you've got numerous homes all around the world, now's an interesting time for you to look at the jurisdiction of your collection. Because if you were going to move things in or move things around, you want to know what your executors are facing in terms of costs. So it would be a good time to inventory.
Jim?
Well, I think if you're making things easy for yourself and for your family, you would record as much information as you can as to where you found these works of art and how you acquired them and what you paid for them and all those statistics. And particularly recently, in the last decade or more, there's been an increased almost fetish about provenance, knowing as much as you can, tracing the history, which is often quite difficult for objects which maybe if you bought them in the 50s or 60s were not a lot of money, and the tradition of tracing provenance hadn't become such an important issue. But the best thing you can do is to enjoy them while you have them and prepare the information that would be most helpful to your heirs should they want to dispose of them after you die.
I'm going to turn to a completely different direction. Drew asks, have any of the speakers had the opportunity to educate Trump about how these tariffs hurt the U.S. art collectors?
Not me.
He hasn't called yet.
I guess Drew is perhaps asking if you had the opportunity, what would your advice be?
I think you'd show him the dollars and cents. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, and he would either say, I'm sympathetic or I'm not. Mm-hmm. And you just make the plea that this is making it more expensive to do business here. And then also about culture and education. But I don't know if that one would convince him as much.
Well, you could also point out that with the prohibitions already in place in China that restrict the export of Chinese art from China, how can you be doing anything except supporting Chinese goals by making it more difficult for people to bring things out of China into the United States, destroy the incentive for people to bring things into the United States from China, is hand in hand with their policy of saying we don't want you exporting things from China.
Right.
I would argue that, and I'm assuming that trade in this category, in the customs schedule, is minuscule compared to other products where tariffs are being applied. So therefore, given that, and given that these tariffs are clearly hurting the U.S. and have no effect on China, give art a break.
Yeah.
So before we end today, I dug into the archives and I found an op-ed dated to November 21st, 1903 in New York Times called The Tariff on Art. And if you will humor me, please let me read this to you. This is 1903, keep in mind. To the editor of the New York Times, what are the ultimate objects of a protective tariff? Is one of them merely a spit-your-face policy to compel foreign producers to pay us a premium in order to sell us what we cannot make or cannot make as well? Is it an effort to discourage imports or a means of raising revenue and nothing more? The principle which governs the making of tariffs has a tremendous influence upon the future producing elements of a nation. A government run upon the principles of a crass, materialistic philosophy with little or no regard for the spiritual, philosophic value of human thought, apart from a sectarian religious aspect, is a government of one day, one time. And this goes on, and I'm going to cut through part of it. Is there any man in Washington or in the country who has had a common school education so asinine as to think a prohibitive duty on objects of art is a protection to the artist and craftsman? And finally, the conclusion. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves, or if we're too thick-skinned for that, let us at least make our habitual boasts where only ourselves can hear, and to save ourselves the humiliation of being scorned for hypocrites and laughed at by all of the world. Signed by Louise Scott Dabble, New York, New York, November 21st, 1903. On that note, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. This is, as Wendy said, unprecedented. We did not know when we first had this idea how we could make this work. And I think tonight's discussion shows that this is just the beginning of more collaborative work between trade, law, and art. And let's continue talking. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight.